The views and opinions expressed on this program are not those of Norfolk State University or WNSB-FM. Thank you for listening.
It's Hampton Roads Voices. Hot 91.
This month is the commemoration of the 400th anniversary of the arrival of the first enslaved Africans to English North America. History has taught us that they arrived in Jamestown. But is that true? And how does actually knowing the real version of slavery affect African Americans today? Hi, everybody. I'm Benita Adams, and today on Hampton Roads Voices, we talk about slavery and its lingering effects on our culture and the 1619 Making of America Summit at Norfolk State University. Our guests include historian Dr. Cassandra Newby Alexander, Dean of the College of Liberal Arts here at Norfolk State University. And, of course, we want to hear from you, our listeners. Next, slavery. Why does it still matter? On Hot 91.
The mission of the College of Liberal Arts is to provide a transformational education, one that enables students to become independent thinkers as well as lifelong learners. The College of Liberal Arts impacts every student who enrolls at Norfolk State University, as every student completes the general core, 60% of which are housed in the College of Liberal Arts. For more information about Norfolk State University and the College of Liberal Arts, visit nsu.edu.
It's Hampton Roads Voices. Hot 91.
Welcome, everybody. I'm Benita Adams, and today on Hampton Roads Voices, we are talking about the commemoration of the 400th anniversary of the arrivals of the first enslaved Africans to English North America. We have been taught a certain history, but we might want to challenge some of those myths today of those histories in terms of the version of slavery and the effect it's had on our African American community. So today on Hampton Roads Voices, we're going to talk about slavery and its lingering effects on our culture, and we're also going to talk about the 1619 Making of America Summit that's going to be held here at Norfolk State University. We have two very interesting guests today, and I know you're going to want to call in, so let me give that number to you. It is 757-823-9110. Slavery, why does it still matter? We first have Dr. Cassandra Newby Alexander. She is the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts here at Norfolk State University. Dr. Newby Alexander, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much.
And we also have Dr. William Alexander. He's a professor of history here at NSU and the director of the international program. Sir, thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
So let me just start out. I always like to have our listeners get a feel for who our guests are. A tiny bit, I know the very short version of both of your bios, and then we'll move from there. So Dr. Newby Alexander, if you'll go first, please.
Sure. Since 2012, we have been putting forward a 1619 Making of America conference series. And the goal for me has been to really reach out to not only the NSU community, but the broader community to talk about this important time period in our nation's history, which is the real founding of America that began in 1619, and especially with the forced arrival of the first Africans to the Virginia colony. And so for me, my whole life, I have been very interested in making sure that we begin to reposition the importance of African American history into the American history narrative. Mm-hmm. In fact, what I always argue is that without African American history is just not accurate.
Absolutely. I love that. We're going to dig deep into that. And Dr. Alexander.
My field initially was European history, but I've done a lot of work in Atlantic history, which brings together cultures of North America, South America, and Africa. And this conference connects with a lot of that because the conference we're dealing with goes back to the early period of colonial history. And we look at, in a sense, the legacies from England and later on other cultures. And we see indeed the development of colonial society. We see the development of slavery and the different forms of slavery that existed in the Atlantic region and beyond. And our conference is trying to deal with not just the fact of slavery, but the changes, the representations of slavery in American culture. And we're going a little bit further with our 1619 conference, and that is we're not just looking at what has happened, but we're thinking about how this can possibly be reframed in the direction of being more inclusive.
More inclusive.
Yeah, and that's really the focus. There have been, as you may know, quite a few programs, conferences, papers, and so on in the last weeks that have dealt with the founding of the United States. But there hasn't been as much focusing on, in a sense, how we can become more inclusive. And as you know, we're a much divided society right now, and that has to be a goal. And what we're trying to do in this conference is to raise some questions about how we can go about, let's say, the revamping of American history.
Absolutely.
With these standards of learning, with textbooks, newspaper articles, and in a sense just an understanding of how we got here, who are we as Americans, and what this means for all of us, this sense of identity.
So we're trying to change the narrative here.
Yes.
In some sense.
Exactly.
In some sense. So let's start with some vocabulary words. And I only say this because I had called an organization and I used the word, I thought I'd seen something that said the celebration of the 400 years. And I was told, no, we're not going to say celebration, we're saying commemoration.
Yes.
Why is that distinction so important?
I'll start first. Because a celebration is something that's wonderful, that's great, that we want to embrace in a very positive way. Versus commemoration is a recognition of what happened and lifting that up to be honored, but not so much to be celebrated, to be happy about, but rather to recognize its importance. And so when we talk about the commemoration of 1619, it is a recognition that especially those individuals who first came, who were kidnapped from the Kingdom of Ndongo, which is today Angola, and they were forced to come to the Virginia colony, that those people did not come willingly.
Right.
That while I argue they were not enslaved because they had not yet arrived at the slave port in Veracruz, Mexico, rather, they were kidnapped a second time by two privateers that were owned by English citizens, and they were brought here. I say that they were brought in bondage, but that bondage did not necessarily imply that they would be permanently in servitude. Rather, from all indications, that was not really the case. And so when we talk about really commemorating that, we want to understand that that was the beginning of African presence, but that was also the beginning of a long arc towards dehumanizing people of African descent, restricting their movements, taking their bodies for the well-being of white society, and using their talents, their abilities, their labor to benefit not them and their progeny, but rather the progeny of white society that would grow and eventually become the United States of America. So when we talk about the founding of this country, the first permanent English settlement in 1607, you read these narratives and you get the impression that after Pocahontas died,
Right.
all Indians disappeared until they popped back up miraculously after the Civil War, and then there are a bunch of Indian wars out west. Those are false narratives. You also have some historians in the past who've talked about from 1607 to the American Revolution as if there are no black people in America, that the issues of freedom that really so many people of African descent helped to really punch into the American psyche as they made efforts to become free, filing freedom suits, running away, initiating revolts, whether it was a servant revolt or a slave revolt, but claiming their freedom in different ways, that helped to define what we really meant by freedom, and how America's character actually was framed by that effort, and how hard society, and especially those in power, fought against that and actually started parsing out, well, you're not really human, you are human, and parsing that out to almost justify the hypocrisy of saying, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among which life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But that didn't apply to people of color. And so it is important that we change that, the way we think about it. For example, when Virginia first initiated the standards of learning, the word slavery was not mentioned anywhere in the standards at all. And even
That's
now,
shocking.
I know, and even now, it's barely mentioned. And that,
Why? Why?
because America does not want to face its past, the good, the bad, the ugly. They just want to frame it in a mythical way to make people feel good about themselves. In 1830, for example, we saw the beginning of a framing of an American narrative that said, oh, we were founded as a Christian nation, and that, God somehow empowered us to spread the gospel and to expand from sea to shining sea. Well, that was a lie. We were not founded as a Christian nation. Jamestown was founded as a corporation to make money. And the only group that came here and said, oh, we're dedicating this land to God, were the Pilgrims who landed at Plymouth Rock in 1620. And even they immediately began to kill the native peoples that they supposedly, who supposedly helped them survive. We have this Thanksgiving celebration, but they were actually almost immediately at war with these native individuals and used religion as a way of justifying it. And some of their most prominent individuals, like Cotton and Mather, and then their progeny, Cotton Mather and others, incorporated very racist ideas and doctrines into the way that they saw religion, claiming that blacks were somehow not human, that, it's that old argument that black women had sex with apes.
Yes.
And Jefferson would repeat it in the Notes on Virginia, that Africans were some hybrid group. So therefore, they weren't really able to have souls and to become real Christians, that whiteness was the only indicator that you had the potential to be a Christian. Blackness was an indicator that you were cursed, and more importantly, that you weren't human. And so those ideas came out of the people who claimed to dedicate this land to God. And so that's the history that if you actually include black people in the narrative, you have to then look at that history.
Right.
And as a nation, we don't want to do that, or haven't wanted to do that until recently.
And that's why it's so important when we're saying that African American history is American history. We have to incorporate that and expand the narrative. Now, Dr. Alexander, for our listeners' sake, I want to make sure that we understand that if there were slaves, before African slaves, what was going on before that time?
Well, it depends on how far back we want to go.
Okay.
Slavery or enslavement happens to be one of the oldest human institutions. And we can go back as far as we can go with organized society, organized civilizations, and so on, and see forms of enslavement. And so it's nothing new. We study it in different ways. We see that some of it is connected with forms of peonage or forms of pawnship. That in Africa, for example, there were forms of slavery where, in many ways, the enslaved people were parts of the family, parts of extended families, and so on. We have it in the Mediterranean. In point of fact, the word slave comes from the word Slav, because before we talk about Atlantic history, the largest group of people who were enslaved in the Mediterranean were people from what we might call southern Russia, the Slavic peoples. And so the word slave comes from the word Slav. And then, of course, the Mediterranean had been a large area of slave slave auctions and so on. We can go all the way before that, hundreds of years back to the Roman Empire, which became based on slavery for the most part in terms of labor, and even going back to the Egyptians and others. So, I mean, it's all over the place. And when we get to the founding of the United States, we can also see at that time that this was not a new thing, if we want to think broadly, in terms of what enslavement was all about. Because the people from England who came over had experience with enslavement, had experience with other people, the Portuguese, the Spanish, the French.
Now, were these indentured servants at the time, or were they considered slaves, actually?
There were various forms.
Various forms, okay.
Yeah. In France, England, and to some extent other areas, but in particular those areas, forms of indentured servitude, where an individual would, in a sense, be contracted to work for a certain period of time, in which case the person would be treated almost like a slave. Then at the end of that, the person's indenture was eliminated. The person then was supposed to receive some bit of land and possibly other equipment and so on. So that was over. The person was then a free person. So there are many forms of indenture. There are forms of people being free or half free. We know that traditional forms of labor in Europe, peasantry and serfdom, were forms where individuals in many cases were virtual slaves, but they had certain traditional customary rights and so on. So it's a long story.
Right.
And
exactly.
even the attitudes Cassandra was speaking about in terms of the derogation, debasement of black people, you see this in Portugal. You see it in France to some extent. You see it to some extent in Spain. It was a phenomenon in Europe where indeed blacks were looked at very negatively. So when the English came over here, I mean, it wasn't particularly a new thing in terms of people not having any idea about this. We've had seminars, for example, at Norfolk State about the Elizabethan period, when during the time of Shakespeare and the other writers and so on. It was a big issue about how blacks were looked at.
Yes.
And we see in a number of Shakespeare's plays and the plays of other Elizabethan writers, representations of black people and so on. So this was a big situation beforehand. I like to say it was an Atlantic-wide situation. But you can go further and say it was a global phenomenon to some extent.
Absolutely.
So there was much to borrow from or to use, to be influenced by when the English came over. And, of course, they then had access to blacks, small numbers in the beginning, and then, of course, more. So there were, indeed, examples of servitude in different forms to draw from. It was not particularly a new form, but it became, obviously, a North American situation.
Definitely. I want to expand on that. Oh, Dr. Newby,
I just wanted to add, there's a perception that only black people were slaves.
Yes.
And there's been a lot of scholarship in the last 10 years to really challenge these assumptions that Indians weren't enslaved, that somehow there was a different kind of system for them that wasn't really slavery, and that's hogwash. Because here in this country, and especially in Virginia, people were being, even with all the treaties, Indians were still being captured and enslaved. And in some cases, sold to other parts of Virginia or sold to Massachusetts or sold to the Carolinas with the name mulatto instead of calling them Indians. They were hiding the fact. In fact, there was a system in place in Virginia in which all of the younger Indians had to be committed to service. And a lot of Indians were not allowing their children to go into this because they knew that as soon as they entered into this kind of apprenticeship, that they would never see them again, that these children would be sold as slaves. And so this was going on all throughout the 17th century. So when 1619 came around and the Africans were being brought in, there were already native peoples who were being enslaved. And even though that was the case, what is interesting to me is that none of the Africans were referred to in any of the records as slaves. They all, throughout half of the 17th century, the term servant was used. Now, does that mean that they weren't held as if it was in perpetuity? No, that does not mean that. Does that mean that they were treated equally or the same as white servants? No, that does not mean that. In fact, I would say that they were, from the beginning, treated very differently. They were treated in a demeaning way because their names often were not recorded, or if their names were recorded, it was only a first name. They anglicized the name, so they weren't even using their name. They recorded them almost as a commodity rather than as a human being. They fell under this sort of servitude that some of the English and other Europeans were under, those who were simply taken as servants. And as long as they didn't serve more than 20 years, which was considered lifetime servitude, they would hold them that long of a time period. And many we are finding in the Virginia Society up through the 1640s and even early 1650s, they were held perhaps about 15 years. So those are the kinds of things that have been left out of our national narrative. I really chafe against this idea of simply referring to the 20 and odd, who, as John Rolfe wrote in his letter to John Smith, of 20 and odd Negars arrived at Old Point Comfort, which is where Fort Monroe is today, in late August of 1619. He didn't refer to them as slaves. He had a phonetic spelling of Negroes, which is a Spanish and Portuguese word for black. So he wasn't even referring to their ethnicity. There were no names mentioned. There were no real numbers mentioned either. We found out from a lot of recent research that about 32 arrived anywhere between late August of 1619 and 3 to 4 days later, because there were two ships, the White Lion first and the Treasurer, total of about 32 who arrived. And so we, as far as we know, some of them may have lived more than 3 or 4 years. Some of them did live more, but we don't know how many. If these were English servants, their names, their fate would have been recorded. We're going to take a quick break now, but on the other side, I find it compelling what you said, even their names. And when you take a person's name, that means a lot. So we're talking about the myths and the narrative being changed in terms of slavery and how it affects us today. We want to hear from you. 757-823-9110. This is Hot 91.
Is Hampton Roads Voices. Hot 91.
Welcome back, everybody. I'm Benita Adams, and welcome to Hampton Roads Voices. Today we're talking about slavery in commemoration of the 400 years of enslaved people here in North America. And we want to look at some myths, and we want to look at how to change that narrative and how it's been taught. How were you taught, or if you were taught about that in terms of American history? Give us a call, 757-823-9110. We still have with us in the studio Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander. She's the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts here at Norfolk State University, and Dr. William Alexander, Professor of History and the Director of the International Program. Again, we're having a great conversation here today. Now, I want to talk about that notion, and I know that our listeners, we've heard of the 40 acres and a mule, and I want to make that connection because you were talking about indentured servants and so forth, and serving 20 years in the Christianity. Talk a little bit about that so our listeners really understand what that means and why we've even heard of that.
What is very interesting is that that whole idea of 40 acres and a mule that came from General Sherman during the Civil War, when he was in the Lower South, and he wanted to make sure that those who had been enslaved had a fresh start. And that was consistent with our history, that when people finished their servitude, whether it was through indentured servitude, where you had a contracted period of time that you served, or if it was you were simply a servant, and after you finished those years of service, you then got some land, because the idea was, we don't want you to be a burden on society. We know that you have worked very hard for however many years, and so now we want to give you a fresh start. so that you can be not only a participant of the society, but you can add something that's important. You can provide some economic enterprise. And so the most important thing that someone can have is land. Because money can go away.
It can.
But land is not going to go away unless there's some sort of sinkhole to take it away. And so they wanted to make sure that people who had worked all their lives on land could have the land and become a farmer and make money through that means. And so what's interesting is there's an exhibit at the Supreme Court of Virginia. And one of the great legal scholars of the late 18th century actually offered or proposed the idea that enslaved people should have reparations of land so that they could have a fresh start, so that our society could move beyond enslavement and begin to allow people to be productive citizens to add to the general outcome of whether it's economic, social outcome of the nation. And so those connections were there. And what we can see in some of the early years of these early Africans, those like Anthony Johnson and Mary Johnson, who were on the Bennett Plantation, which was on the James River. And he arrived in 1623. He was forced to come, and his wife, that he would later meet, of course, after she came in 1624. They married. Both of them were from that region still, what we call Angola today. They married, and about 15, 20 years later, they gained their freedom. And they were given head rights, land, on the eastern shore in Accomack County. And he became such a prosperous plantation owner that he actually owned an enslaved man who came here as a slave, as well as white servants.
Really?
And Virginia, the legislature that started a month before the first Africans were forced to come here, ended up passing a law in that same time period. We're talking about the 1660s by then, saying that black people could not own white servants. And that if you're a freeholder, meaning a voter, you had to be white male. Why? Because Anthony Johnson owned white servants, and he was about to become a freeholder because his plantation did so well that he was owning a lot of property and he was generating a lot of revenue. And they did not want him to be able to have the right to vote. So you started to see the laws changing in the 1650s and 60s, specifically to restrict privileges of citizenship and law to whites.
And see, that's an interesting thing to me. My grandfather, he owned 44 acres. I know when I was a little girl in Tennessee. And someone asked me, they said, how was it that your grandfather came to own, as a black man, 44 acres of land? And so it wasn't until I actually heard you say that once in terms of this, what a privilege that is to have owned that much land as a black man in the South, in a small little community in the segregated South. And so that's so important. But my question is, was that equitable? Did it really happen? I know what it said, you're supposed to get 40 acres and a mule and so forth, but how did that actually play out? Did it play out as it should have, or did it not? Did some get it? Did some not get it? And then I want to move into reparation in a moment. So did this work?
This particular thing that I mentioned about General Sherman, that started toward the end of the Civil War. And after Lincoln was assassinated and his vice president, Andrew Johnson, came into office, Johnson, who made no bones about his racism, retracted that and said, no, we're not going to carry that out. So whether or not those who received that land got it back, probably it was taken from them. And I say that because here in Virginia and in the Hampton Roads area, there were hundreds of freed people who were freed because of the different acts that were passed, but especially because of the 13th Amendment, had actually purchased abandoned lands lands that had been abandoned by Confederates, white Confederates who had fled the area. When they returned, Andrew Johnson gave them their land back and did not compensate the blacks who purchased that land for their purchase. And so we would see that kind of pattern repeat itself throughout American history. In fact, even in the 1950s, 60s, and beyond, you would see states taking a hold of the land of African Americans and condemning that land so that they could use that land for the highways, for developments that would later supplant blacks out of that area and allow for whites to live in that area. So that's been an ongoing issue.
And do we not see that now in gentrification to some degree? Do you make a connection?
Oh, it's absolutely.
That?
It's just name changes.
It's just name changes. That's why I said we started with vocabulary, one word meaning one thing, one perhaps another, and the ramifications and connotations of that. And so we see that. And that's amazing.
Yes, you also see the elimination, the erasure of institutions, that are in the form of a building that relates to blacks. In fact, most of the institutions that you still see standing are mostly black churches. But you don't see neighborhoods that had funeral homes, that put up monuments, that did all these things that you see in white society because they used urban renewal. They used all kinds of other names to erase blacks from that landscape. In fact, I always think about Emancipation Oak that's located right next to I-64 just before you get to the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel. Hampton University was the one that preserved that tree. That tree that was here 400 years ago. It was a small twig of a tree, only about 10, 12 years old, when those first Africans were forced to arrive here in Virginia. That tree was the tree that represented emancipation. It was a tree that Mary Kelsey Peak, who was a free black from Norfolk, who had moved to Hampton, and she was teaching people secretly how to read and write because it was against the law not only to teach enslaved blacks how to read and write, but also free blacks how to read and write. That was seen as the most dangerous thing in the world.
Absolutely.
And so she was teaching them. And when the church burned down that she was in, First Baptist Church in Hampton, she would teach them under that oak tree. And the Emancipation Oak is a live oak tree, what they call a live oak tree, and that area is the furthest north that tree can grow. And that tree can live on average about 1,500 years. And so that tree was almost destroyed by the state of Virginia because it was in a black neighborhood, and they had taken I-64 and mowed down most of the black neighborhoods throughout the entire Commonwealth. So if you go to Richmond's black neighborhood, the Jackson Ward, was almost completely obliterated because they took 64 as well as part of 95 and cut the neighborhood in half and destroyed all the buildings. So Maggie Walker's building, many of the main funeral homes, completely destroyed because of where they placed that interstate. And so we're just talking interstates here,
right?
Not including all of the routes, the Virginia routes. They did the same thing because they did not regard the black communities as important, and in some cases they saw them as a threat because they had huge business communities. Downtown Hampton, if you look at the names of the streets, Grant and Lincoln and so forth, that was the Grand Contraband Camp. That's where so many blacks throughout this region of Virginia fled to the Fort Monroe area, resettled, and that's where they built important businesses. One of the first black banks, black-owned banks, was started right there in Hampton, and they did so well that many of the white banks started looking at the practices of that bank and mimicked them to be successful as well. And that bank moved eventually to Norfolk, still keeping a branch there in Hampton. If you can imagine, that whole neighborhood was leveled, during the 1960s for urban renewal and never rebuilt. And we would see Church Street here in Norfolk built, rebuilt, black businesses razed, completely destroyed at least 3 times since the 1920s.
And you think what that does to the foundation of a community,
Yes.
what it does to a people, what it does for a legacy.
Yes.
Right there alone. I want to invite our listeners to give us a call, 757-823-9110. 757-823-9110. We were talking about the history of slavery and how it's affected African Americans and other peoples. Give us a call, 757-823-9110. So let's talk a little bit before we take a break about reparation. We'll come back on the other side. I heard you say, Dr. Newby Alexander, about reparation not just in dollars and cents, but in schools and businesses, and to give back in that way. And to me, that makes so much more sense, even just based on what you've said, and why that type of reparation would be so important for our community.
Well, you know, I kind of like to expand this 400-year arc that we're talking about, and talk about the 400 years of perseverance and the 400 years of the presence of people of African descent in this country. Because, you know, slavery was a condition that was forced upon us, and it was so much a part of not only our lives and the lives of our ancestors, but the lives of many whites, the lives of many Indians who are here in this country too, even though they were the beneficiaries in some cases, as opposed to those of us who are of African descent. We were the ones whose families were separated, whose lives in some cases were destroyed. Many women suffered rapes on a regular basis, and yet these people persevered. And they not only persevered, but they did incredible work. When you look at the first generation free people who were born anytime around the Civil War era, those individuals in one generation became physicians, became nurses, became entrepreneurs, they became lawyers, they became scholars in one generation.
One generation.
And you can see at the end of the century how laws were changed to stop that progress and actually to push it back. And so there was an effort to, I guess, you know, in so many ways, to put a foot of oppression on the necks of African Americans, and yet they still continue to thrive, but not as much as they could have had there not been a concerted effort to pull back that progress. So you're looking then at the perseverance. When it comes to reparations, I know a lot of people are always thinking about reparations for slavery, but I say again, let's look at that 400-year arc, because we can just look at segregation and talk about here in Norfolk State, 75 years of underfunding, and the state settles that with $10 million. How can you settle 75 years of underfunding for such a paltry amount of money? What I could build 75 years ago, I'm not going to be able to build with that little bit of money you're giving.
Absolutely.
And so that to me is where the conversation should begin. And if we look at the institutions that will create stability in the community, we look at, let's remove this unequal funding of schools, looking at someone's income level. Rather, if we want people to achieve, we must focus on equity, not equality based on income, but equity across the board. Because someone who's poorer and who has been in a system, their families have been in poverty for generations, needs more assistance than someone who's wealthy, whose families have deeper pockets to support them. We need preschool and after-school programs. We need intense assistance in providing opportunities for jobs and careers. We know that African Americans were disproportionately affected with the last real hard economic downturn we had, and still are recovering. And so why are African Americans not assisted more with student debt as opposed to less with student debt?
But then you hear the opponents of that saying, well, they'll pull themselves up by their own bootstraps, and that doesn't seem fair. And why do these kids over here get this, and why would... I'd hear them saying that.
I'd like to see somebody able to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. First of all, think of the imagery of that. Your boots are on, your feet. How are you going to pull yourself up when you have to reach down? That doesn't even make common sense to do that. But at the same time, you have to understand there are also impediments. We have standards of learning and all these kids taking tests. If the tests are that great, why aren't private schools mandated to take those tests as well? Instead, there's a get out of jail free card for all of the private schools, but yet all of the public schools are mandated to take a test that actually has wrong answers on it. And so it's amazing to me, our society is set up to perpetuate the status quo, while at the same time blaming the people who are the most needy for not rising above their station, while providing all the benefits to those already with all that they need plus.
All they need plus, and opportunities. And I put that question out to our listeners, 757-823-9110. The concept of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. The concept of inequity. What have you experienced? Let's talk about that. 757-823-9110. This is Hot 91.
Is Hampton Roads Voices. Hot 91.
Welcome back, everybody, to Hampton Roads Voices. We're talking today about the commemoration of the 400th anniversary of the arrival of enslaved Africans here in North America. And we know that the entire concept of slavery, in terms of how it has been taught in the schools and what we've learned, that narrative, that conversation needs to be changed. And we have as our guest Dr. Cassandra Newby Alexander, who is here. She is the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts here at Norfolk State University. Dean, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
And we have Dr. William Alexander, Professor of History and the Director of the International Program. Sir, thank you for being here as well.
You're welcome. Glad to be here.
So right before we took our break before the first hour, I love the concept that we were talking about perseverance of African American people. And I know this can go across the board with many groups of people, but I think the concept, sometimes you hear the myth of, I'm just going to use the myth of the strong black woman, the myth of the strong black family. But to hear you talk about it, it's not a myth. No. It's reality.
Yes.
And that's the important part.
Absolutely. And that's what, when you look at American history, that is the one thing that is most startling about all of the things that people of African descent have had to endure. And yet they persevered, and not only persevered, but they accomplished great things. I mean, think about most people don't know that the reason that the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, which was seen, it wasn't the first black regiment during the Civil War, but it was the most known. It was actually the second one that was formed, but it was the most known. It was the largest one. The reason that they went to New Bedford, Massachusetts to recruit young African-American men to that regiment is because those young men were either fugitive slaves themselves, they were freedom seekers, or they were the children of those who had escaped some years prior to that. So they had a passion, such a passion for freedom that they were willing to risk their lives. And that was a haven for hundreds of freedom seekers, and that was the perfect place. And so you can imagine that these individuals went back, those who survived went back home and became leaders in their community. We had one of them who was actually a conductor on the Underground Railroad from Norfolk, and ended up in New Bedford, Massachusetts, and joined the 54th, came back to Norfolk. He He had finished his apprenticeship as a dentist. He came back to Norfolk, set up practice, and entered politics and was part of the group framing the new 1868 Constitution for the Commonwealth of Virginia. And he was one of many who did just that. So the story of perseverance and the story of success actually is, I find, more important than the story of slavery, though the story of slavery has colored and has been such an important part of American history and such an important part of our economy. Without slavery, even the economies of Europe would not have risen the way they did. And so when we talk about that institution, consider that if you add up all of America's institutions at the start of the Civil War, that all of them added together did not equal the institution of slavery and the amount of money that was being generated by that institution. Historians have estimated that that was at least $1 billion in terms of industry for the nation. America produced 7/8 of the world's cotton production in 1860. So when you consider all of that, you know, what would America have been like without black people? It would have been a very different place.
A very different place. So let's take the concept of perseverance and the concept of the thirst for freedom. Is it still here? And if not, where has it gone? How do we get it back?
I think the idea and let's say the concept is still here. We had, obviously, in American history, just as in any country's history, we've had cycles. And, of course, we had a very high cycle during the Civil Rights Movement. There had been others. The Black Power movement was another high. Now, indeed, it's just hard to say because our leadership is very much divided. We don't have, in a sense, a single leadership that a lot of people seem to crave. The one person like King, that people could say, this is our leader, and so on. Leadership generally doesn't go that way in history. You have a few leaders, but quite often, there are factions of people and so on, and different leaders, whatever. But it seems that if you look at, this, in a sense, the whole 400 years, first of all, the long period of slavery and enslavement, where indeed blacks were contributing so much in terms of labor, as Cassandra said, particularly in the development of the use of raising of cotton and what that meant for the world economy and so on. And then later, blacks were enslaved, and then, once there was at least a suggestion of freedom and so on, what you have is the Jim Crow period. And during that period, up till not many decades ago, blacks were contributing a great deal, paying a lot of taxes, but were unable to enjoy the fruits of American society.
Definitely.
And so when you talk about, the whole issue of reparations, it's very difficult in a sense, except in a very broad fashion, to talk about enslavement when you're dealing with issues of property and so on. You know that there has been a great imposition on black culture, black history, and so on, and that blacks have contributed so much and have gotten so little proportionately. When you get to the period of Jim Crow, you have a lot of documents, individual situations in cities where black individuals have paid taxes. We all have paid taxes. I was born into the Jim Crow era. And yet, we couldn't go to hospitals in our own towns if we were sick. We couldn't go to schools. They were segregated, and blacks always got, the lesser materials to work with in schools or the hand-me-down things. So you have, a whole history of this. So there is a groundwork for reparations. Most people who are really talking about this seriously don't say that it should be a bunch of money given to each person. They are talking about institutions and how we can refurbish institutions that have, in many cases, weakened, that we can give blacks perhaps more funds to maintain their properties. As Cassandra was saying earlier, we know that one of the vanishing species in this country is a black farmer. Only a very small number relative to the population. And it's getting smaller almost every day. We know that in terms of areas like South Carolina, a good example, and Georgia, the Gullah culture. Cassandra and I visited the area some years ago, and it was very sad to see that all of this area, which had belonged to blacks, now belong to developers, and not casinos, but resorts and so forth. And blacks were living in trailers and working as service workers, to support these things. But they couldn't pay the taxes because, with the property valuations, the taxes had gone up so high, most of them just couldn't hold onto their land. This, whether you call it deliberate or not, this is the way a lot of blacks were, disenfranchised, disinherited in terms of their land and so on. So a lot of these techniques, the ones Cassandra was talking about and many others, have combined to indeed disenfranchise blacks and so on. And now what do we have? We're here at this point where supposedly we talk about democracy and opportunity and all of that, and yet what do we see? This whole movement that is in many forms to suppress black voters. And this is being done by legislatures and so on in places like North Carolina and so on. So if you put all of this together, you can see blacks have had to persevere, and it's not over. And, we don't have perhaps the leaders we've had. We're getting now, I think, as a result of 2018 and so on, we're getting to see more people rising.
Right.
But we need still more.
I don't want to get too much off topic, but I do want to follow up on something that you said, and that was kind of a central leader, as we had King and those kinds of things. And it's so interesting that just in my class yesterday, one of my assignments is if you could meet a famous person. Someone said Dr. King, and I said, do you think he would have been as relevant, but not relevant, but able to do what he did presently as he did in the past? So my question to you is that what we need, a central leader to help with what we're trying to accomplish, what we're trying to get back, trying to, with preparation? Is that something you're saying we need, or that's not really what we're looking for?
King was important, that period. I think now what we need is, what to some extent we're getting more local leaders, the Cory Bookers, the Abrams, and so on. We need people in different areas because there's so much to be done. The idea of a single leader is just not going to work. Because, when you have one, that person is sort of like a lightning rod, and that's both good and bad. And the person, as in King's case, becomes one who's targeted. What we need, though, is many different leaders. And I think to some extent we're getting some of this, but it's a slow process. But I think that's going to help us more than anything. But we've got to, look at the divisions that are taking place, and we've got to decide, which way we want to go. I mean, it's one thing to dream about the future and all of this, the promised land. We've got to get there by doing things. I think if King were alive now, he would say that also. It's more about activity and agency and so on. We did that to some extent in slavery. A lot of blacks did a lot of things, even when oppressed. And now we've, even though we don't have that kind of challenge, we have other challenges, and they're manifold, and we have to, act.
Absolutely.
And I want to mention that there are a lot of younger people in the Gen X generation, millennials, and the Gen Zs, who really want to they remind me of the old concept of a race man and a race woman, that I want to use the resources that I'm generating from my professions and give back to the community to ensure that I'm not going to be the last one who occupies this position, but there will be a constant reaffirmation of people coming through and finding their own heart song, their own accomplishments, and doing well, but giving back to the community. There was a period of time at the end of the civil rights period when people had this notion that somehow you eliminate the laws, you'll eliminate the prejudice, you'll eliminate the obstacles. But of course, we know that if you've had 350 years of this, it's not going to disappear in a year or two. It's not going to disappear in another 100 years. It's going to take at least half of that time that it took to create it to disassemble it. And so there was this lapse. it's from my generation of the baby boomers where so many of us thought, oh, well, we've arrived and we don't have to keep pressing and we don't have to keep giving back. Instead, we wanted to put the segregated communities of our past as far in our rear view mirror as possible, and we wanted to move into white communities in many cases to integrate them so that we could enjoy all of the resources that white society essentially put into white communities and leave those other areas behind us. But instead of what we should have done was to maintain this pipeline of money and resources and so forth to the communities that we left. There should have been advocacy for building up those communities, and instead there was no equity. Because if you have a community in which there were no sidewalks, no internal plumbing in a lot of the places, you can't just suddenly say, okay, well, now you have to suddenly have all of these things when you don't put additional monies into making sure that they're there. And so we seemingly forgot that even with the end of the laws, you will continue to have the practices. And so a lot of young people now are finding out that it's hard to get loans.
Yes.
It's hard to get the kind of support that they need. Even though they see the needs are there and very intense, but the resources aren't there to help. And in my mind, that's where some of the reparations must go. Many of our young people, especially those who are here at Norfolk State University, first-generation college students, but even those who aren't, their families were disproportionately harmed by the economic downturn. Why are they having to pay so much in debt, in student loan debt, trying to get a college degree and still not having access to the kinds of career opportunities that many whites going to other schools automatically have access to? And so I know that in the College of Liberal Arts, we're trying to create programs that will allow our students to be career ready and partnering with a number of agencies to begin changing that. But to have a single leader always will introduce corruption. But to have multiple leaders and to focus on policy changes and on funding coming into support helps to kind of offset the corruption. And I mean, all you have to do is look at what does a charismatic single leader do. We can look at our president, Donald Trump, and see that often that leads to a lot of fascism, that leads to a lot of racism, that leads to a lot of hate baiting, because that's the easiest way to get a lot of people on your side. But it's never a good ending for people like that. And history is littered with charismatic leaders. Think of Hitler, for example, definitely, who always had a bad ending. And even recently, Mugabe. That's right. I mean, you know, and ironically, who undermines him but this young wife that he marries, and she's the one who overthrows him. And so, you know, you look at this system of autocratic leadership, and that always is what happens when you lift up a human being so high that they become almost a god-like creature. And human beings will never, ever be perfect. That's why it is troubling to me that we've lifted up Martin Luther King to be someone other than a human being.
Almost godlike, of course.
Yes.
Almost,
and then we tear him down because he did not live up to those unreachable goals, and what he is as what he was as a human being does not detract from his courage, did not detract or should not detract from what he said and what he did. But when you lift people up to that level, that's always what's going to happen.
It's a problem. 757-823-9110 is the number to call in. We want your thoughts on reparation. We want your thoughts on how it has been a part of your thinking and so forth. 757-823-9110. We're going to take a break in a couple of moments, but I want to think about what we've just said, and it makes me ask the question, is it no wonder that some of our young people are angry? Is it no wonder that all the inequities that we've been talking about the last hour and 15 minutes, that there is an anger out there among our young people? And the second part of that is, are the movements working, in your opinion, now, the Black Lives Matter movement and some of the other movements, to move us forward? So I'm looking at two parts. We'll just take one of those. Is there any wonder that perhaps there's some anger out there?
I just think a lot of people are angry because they don't know what to do.
Okay.
And while Black Lives Matter, of course, concerns all of us, people often need to have their own experience for them to get behind that kind of movement. So in the civil rights movement, all black people were harmed by segregation, by the restrictions, by the exclusion. And that helped some people, because it was a small minority, who actually got behind it and began to protest publicly. What we're trying to do, and especially through our 1619 Making of America Summit, is get young people, first of all, to know a little bit of this history and to see that there has been a 400-year arc. So where do we start? And where are we now? What has been this journey? And where do we need to go? Because it's the young people that you need to see, don't repeat the same mistakes of the past. Don't act like you're just starting from nothing. You have a long arc of history here. Once you understand that, then where do you go? And so a lot of our speakers are talking about that. We'll have Nate Parker, who created an incredible project called the HBCU Storytellers, who's going to be here with the president of that organization, the Nate Parker Foundation, Brian Favors, to talk about this incredible project that young people from different universities, HBCUs around the country, including several of our own students, this project where they did a film, and the film is going to be previewed at the summit, but this film that's talking about this 400-year journey. And so their understanding, their journey in learning about the 400 years is reflected in that film, and it is a very powerful story.
That's exciting. We'll take a break here. We'll come back to the other side. We're going to talk about this summit. This is Hot 91.
Is Hampton Roads Voices on Hot 91.
Welcome back, everybody, to Hampton Roads Voices. We have in our studio to continue with us for the rest of the hour Dr. Cassandra Newby Alexander, the Dean and College of Liberal Arts of Norfolk State University, and Dr. William Alexander, Professor of History here and the Director of the International Program. And we're talking about the 1619 Making of America Summit. It's American Evolution. That's Norfolk State University, September 25th through 28th. And we want to talk about that because we definitely want you to be there. Call in with your questions, 757-823-9110. So let's start talking about this, Dr. Alexander, the whole genesis of it, how it got started, the thinking process, and why it's so important.
Well, so much of it was Cassandra's idea some years ago. Around 2012, we decided to put together a conference, and it was the first one that really went into the whole idea of 1619, and Hampton was doing some things in that direction. But the whole idea was to, since we were coming up on 2019, 400 years, the first blacks coming through this area, Point Comfort over in the Hampton region, the idea was to see this as an important period, as something that started the inclusiveness in American society, because roughly at the same time you have the beginning of the House of Burgesses in terms of Virginia law's history. You have around that time white women coming over, to start families and so on. You have a number of things that simply came together, coalesced at a certain point. So we had conferences where we invited scholars from all over the country, and we had some marvelous speakers here that dealt with that in 2012 and 2013, and then we had smaller conferences thereafter. And then we've gotten to the point now where everybody has been talking about 2019, And so for the past year and a half, we've been focusing on preparation here for that. A few weeks ago, Hampton had a first landing program to commemorate the arrival of the 2019 through Point Comfort. And other places have had similar ones. There's been a big discussion about landings and beginnings in other parts of what we now call the United States. But it was very important for Virginia because Virginia, in a sense, started this country in many ways, and the fact that these 20 and odd Africans who came here were indeed part of this early beginnings of Virginia history. So that became very important, sort of a symbol of what we're trying to do. Now, for our purposes, we're concerned not only with, in a sense, what has happened, but the fact that what has happened has excluded, in many ways, the contributions of black people, Native Americans, also women in a way. And our whole thing has been to try to focus on inclusivity and to bring all of these things together and to try to create a new narrative. And so what we've done is, for this summit conference, which we're having on the 25th through the 28th of this month, what we're trying to do is divide, categorize in a sense, some of the important themes into 4 parts. And the 4 parts are, first of all, reimagining representations of people of color. In other words, how have blacks, for example, and Native Americans been looked at by the majority populations? How are they represented in the media and so on? Have these been prejudiced? To what extent? And how indeed can we maybe reframe these portraits through the media, through history books and so on, the standards of learning? So a lot of this is to get rid of the stereotypes and to create a more positive history that is very inclusive. So we start with finding America's roots to see the beginnings, Point Comfort and so on, the beginnings in Africa, and pull all that together, reimagining the representations of people of color. And then we work on trying to reframe the narrative. And we ask the question, in a sense, can we reframe the narrative in such a way that it includes all of these people? And so it becomes, in a sense, a true American history, not one that excludes so much of the population, and so on. And then the final of these 4 themes is really America's future. And we put this around the concept of citizenship and law. And what we're going to be doing there is defining, of course, what citizenship is, and asking the question, to what extent do people of color have access to the full fruits of citizenship? And how have they been denied citizenship? And obviously key to this is the whole voting issue, which we thought was taken care of some years ago.
We did think that.
Yes. And now it's just as big as it's ever been in a way, and so on. And there's so many subtle ways, not only voter suppression, but possible conspiracies and so on. So it's a big issue to discuss. So we're concerned about laws and seeing how indeed the laws today have an impact on the role of people of color and women and so on. So those are our general themes. And to those directions, we've assembled quite a few outstanding people in the media, scholars, historians, and so on, politicians. We have a few politicians who are going to be here. And we're going to have all of them on a series of panels and breakout sessions where their ideas are further discussed. And we're going to try to pull all this together with, to try to create this common narrative and so on. And we have quite a selection of persons here. We're going to start off with also contributions from our music department, our choir, which is first rate, of course, and our jazz groups and so on, which are equally good. Nate Parker, as Cassandra said, is going to be here. He'll be one of the high points of the whole conference. And he's going to be contributing ideas about the way the media presents blacks and ways in which that can be modified and so on over time, reframed.
And if I could just add this, he's also going to be talking about his new film. Because, many of the people who are on that panel are talking, because we have films about blacks, we have films about Native peoples, Latinos. So how are our filmmakers, you have Oscar Micheaux, who back in the 1920s was, making a splash and doing a presentation about black people, while it was still in so many ways stereotypic, this is from a black person's perspective on looking at black people and framing those narratives so that people of color can come and see a film about themselves made by a person who's also black. And so since the 1950s and 60s, we've had black filmmakers. They've been few, but we've had them. But now we have not just directors, but we have black producers, we have black companies. So they're not just they're not just acting, they're not just directing, but they're involved in how is this film really, how's the script being written, how is this film being marketed. So it's the marketing of the film, it's being in control of the script writing so that you leave out a lot of those stereotypes that are typically seen in films about black people. That's what we're starting to see now. But then there are so many challenges to that. And Nate Parker is a perfect example of someone who still sees so many of those challenges. You all know he's a Norfolk native. He still has family here in Norfolk. And yet, here's someone who was accused of rape so many years ago, and that's always the first question.
That's right.
2 decades ago this happened. He was exonerated, but that continues to be the same question that they keep asking him. So again, he's the embodiment in so many ways of these images, these stereotypic images that the media keeps rolling out of especially black men. So how can we go beyond that and become the orchestrators of our own images and the challenges that we're still facing?
And that's why that's so important to tell our own story in our own way to get the message out that we know we need to get out.
Yeah. And William, you have some other one of the films that will be there is about Rumble. It's entitled Rumble, and it's about Native peoples and just that whole idea of, how have we been seeing Native Americans or Indians in our country? We act as if they disappeared after Pocahontas died,
definitely.
and that's a whole myth right there about Pocahontas. And what I mean by a myth is that there was some sort of love relationship between her and John Rolfe, and so many people claiming descendancy from their one child who, in terms of the documents, never had any children. So how can you be a descendant
I
of
think
non-existent?
Disney might have had something to do with all this. Disney.
But how have Native peoples been presented? How many times, if you look at the old Westerns, has it always been the Indians were the villains and the whites were the good guys?
Of course.
And some of the Indians were played by white people.
Yes, they were. Yes, they were.
So these images of Native people and their culture has been so perverted for so long, and so they're now filmmakers who are out there changing the way that they're being perceived. And this also goes into the music industry.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And this is so important, as we're saying, as we're changing the narrative, and as we're saying the African-American history is a part of American history. It's the story. What would this country be without that as well? I find the immigration piece so interesting, as you were talking about voting and those kinds of things. I want to speak maybe to young people on this just a little bit. How important is that connection, at least that part of this entire summit? What are you looking for from maybe NSU students or the younger generation? What connection would you like them to make with that particular piece?
Well, one thing to include is that we have 2 students who are going to be on our panels.
Excellent.
Yeah, 2 outstanding young ladies who are going to be contributing in terms of raising questions and giving their own perspectives and so on. But this immigration, of course, is a big issue. And of course, the United States is the result of immigration and so on. And the whole variety of this country and so on is based on the contributions of so many people. But indeed, this gets into also citizenship. Now, to be sure, this is a worldwide problem, a very worldwide issue, and countries are dealing with it differently. The United States, though, has always been a country that's opened its doors to people from other cultures. What we're doing now is, of course, in direct opposition to what our history and our tradition has been.
Oh, definitely.
And so on. So the question is, how does this connect with citizenship and what America is supposed to mean, the whole idea of America and so on, and how we configure that. So, part of what we're going to be doing and listening to people and the questions and answers and so on to see indeed how they think America should be looked at. To what extent can we be open to the world? As the Statue of Liberty says, well, of course, at least one person we know wants to change the whole motto from the Statue of Liberty.
Yes.
And so on, a Virginian, by the way. So the whole idea is very important, and we want students to get involved very much. So we're reaching out to students in various in high schools and so on, and other colleges. We want students to be actively involved.
Okay, good.
And we want them to raise questions and to give us ideas about, because they're going to be in this next generation, how indeed this whole idea of an inclusive America can be reframed. Or the issue is maybe if one feels it can't be, then that has to be brought out also. But our hope is that we'll have a positive approach to it, even more positive approach as a result of this conference.
Absolutely. Dr. Nubiak-Sam,
I want to jump in and say, I think what we're seeing right now is the clash between the idealism of America being this open, wide open nation, accepting everyone, and the reality of America, which is not that case. America has always been open to Western Europeans, but it has not been open to Chinese.
Yes.
It's not been open to most Asians. It has not been open even to people from Ireland at one point, or people from Southern Europe, or
Yes.
and it certainly wasn't open to anyone from Africa,
Definitely.
unless they came in as enslaved people. And so this notion of who are Americans is at the foundation of our question for this summit, and has been since 2012. This idea of who are we, and in that segment on finding America's roots, just because you may identify today as a white American does not mean you don't have African roots, because we found that some of the people who came in intermarried with white people, and after a few generations were now officially called white. And that rule then would start changing as we got into the 18th and 19th centuries to the one-drop rule, where it didn't matter how much, you think about Sally Hemings.
Yes.
She was 1/8 black, and yet the way that people referred to her as Dusky Sal, there was nothing that would make you look at that woman and think she was black. She looked just like Thomas Jefferson's wife, who died, because she was Thomas Jefferson's half-sister.
Right.
And from all the accounts, she looked just like his wife. In fact, I have to ask this question. Thomas Jefferson, being former President of the United States, statesman, author of the Declaration of Independence, there's not a single portrait that has survived of his wife. Why?
What a
This
question.
man was prominent. All of this stuff with Sally Hemings that not only surrounded him during his time in office and so forth, but continued. He had a daughter. Her portrait survived, but not his wife. His daughter wanted to make sure that all the rumors of Sally Hemings was squashed, and she did a lot to try to do that. While it's my theory that she destroyed those portraits, I really have to go back to, what happened, because that would have told us what Sally Hemings really looked like. And so the idea of trying to erase the intermixtures that were happening between blacks and whites, sometimes willingly, most of the time unwillingly.
Yes.
That looking at what our real roots are, I think is important. It's an important starting point, that we stop lying to ourselves about who we are and start looking at who we are, acknowledging our past, so that our present and our future can be something different than the racism of our past that began as a society in 1619.
That's right. Who are Americans? Who are allowed to be Americans? I think those are really important questions. 757-823-9110 is the number to call. We invite you to call. We're talking about the 1619 Making of America Summit that's going to be here at Norfolk State University. This is Hot 91. Welcome back to Hampton Roads Voices. We're here. We want to hear from you, 757-823-9110. And we're talking about the 1619 Making of America Summit. And we have in Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander from Norfolk State University, as well as her husband here. So what do you want? I know we've talked about the genesis of the summit. Dr. Newby-Alexander, I'm going to start with you. What are you looking for in terms of participation? I want our listeners to say, I fit in here somewhere with the summit. Mm-hmm. What are you looking for in terms of our student population here at Norfolk State? Dr. Alexander, you mentioned, reaching out to schools and so forth. But anything overall, I just want to make sure our listeners hear.
I want people to be immersed not only in what the conference provides culturally, but also intellectually. To let this be a beginning of more dialogue about these issues. But before you can actually talk about something, you have to know about something.
Right.
And so we're bringing in scholars, we're bringing in personalities, we're bringing in the people who are doing these things that are reflected in these different categories, in these different themes. Rick Murphy, for example, who's the president of the African American Genealogical Society, this is a national organization, who's done research and has actually traced his own family roots back to 1619. He's going to be talking about his journey in finding that out and uncovering what has been shrouded in a lot of information that's been mangled, that's been left out of the history. And so those are the kinds of things we want people to actually engage in that discussion, learn a little bit more. When we did the sesquicentennial conference back in 2010, there was a professor at William & Mary who was listening online to the discussion, and we talked about the myth of all these black Confederates. And then she looked at the textbook that her daughter was reading that included that myth as if it was fact and brought that to people's attention. So it changed what was happening in Virginia. Where did it start? Right here at Norfolk State, where we were there talking just about that topic. And she happened to be a parent who was listening to the discussion, and it helped to change certain things going on here in the Commonwealth of Virginia. So I want people to do the same thing, to hear what we're saying, because we can't be everywhere. We don't know what is happening at every level. But everyone in the community has a stake in this, and they need to listen. When we talk about law and citizenship, for example, this nonsense, this birtherism nonsense,
oh yes,
It goes back to this old racist idea that black people are not citizens. And of course, we know that there was a Supreme Court case in 1857 that declared that black people were not citizens. But up until that point, many were seen, free blacks were seen to having some degree of citizenship. And so we still keep going back to these old notions that are racist in their foundations, of people who somehow, even though they might have an American parent like President Barack Obama, somehow he's not supposed to also be an American citizen. He was born in the United States, and somehow, because he's black, his citizenship is questioned by the very people who are the recent immigrants to this country, as opposed to those who've been here for 400 years or more. And so the conference is designed to give people that information, because knowledge is power. and with knowledge and power, and then the ability to have discussions. We have breakout sessions on Thursday, on September 26th, that will allow people to talk about in a safe environment and with scholars to talk about the issues that they're hearing at these panel discussions. And then in the evening on that Thursday, people can go see the film Rumble that's talking about Native American issues. They can come and see Jim of the Ocean that focuses on the character Aunt Esther, who for August Wilson, he created this character who was born in 1619 to remind the people in the play of their history and their origins, or go see the musical presentation by our NSU choir. On Friday, we start off, we have Juan Williams, who's the moderator, who's going to be talking to a whole host of scholars as well as celebrities, talking about these two issues about, about not finding the roots, but about law and citizenship.
And reframing.
And reframing our narrative. And then we're going to conclude with a very powerful film in the late afternoon, Ghosts of Amistad, in which Marcus Rediker, who made that film, journeyed to Liberia. And many of the people that he interviewed, all the people actually, that he interviewed died in the Ebola epidemic that hit Liberia. But talking about this, the Amistad ship, which showed that the slave trade was still going on way past the time period that it was supposed to have ended, and these individuals and their descendants who have been caught up in this, and tracing it back to Liberia, which was an independent nation, was created by one of our natives, Joseph Jenkins Roberts, who was born here in Norfolk, and talking about how those remnants still are impacting that space on the African continent. And then on that Saturday, people will have a guided tour of all these historic sites that deal with the first landing of the Africans at Old Point Comfort at Fort Monroe, take you to the Tucker Cemetery, where this young man, William Tucker, was recorded to have been born, the first document that we have of an African child born in the Virginia colony, and his family cemetery, taking you all the way to historic Jamestown, where they're doing an archaeological dig to find the first named African woman named Angela, and where she lived. They've already found 3 graves that they believe are either African or Native people, and to go on that journey of trying to uncover the silences that we have in history because their stories were not recorded.
The silences, the gaps, the holes that we're trying to fill.
Yeah, we have two, by the way, outstanding, a lot of outstanding historians, but among them is Michael Gomez, who was here for our second conference. And he's the co-founder of the whole society, the study of the African American diaspora, the black diaspora, and so on. And he's a prominent scholar at New York University, and he has done a lot on the migration of peoples, Islamic peoples and others and so on from Africa, and the mixtures of people and so on. And then we have Dr. Ed Ayers, who is a prominent scholar of the American South and American history, formerly University of Virginia, president of University of Richmond, and so on. So we've got some extraordinary scholars who will really put forth information that's, state of the art.
Absolutely. We only have a few minutes left. I do definitely want to talk about contact information for this. But my last question is, how do we continue this dialogue about a new narrative? Both of you, please. Dr. Nubia Alexander, I'll start with you first.
Well, we have 2 initiatives in the College of Liberal Arts. The Center for African American Public Policy that launched one of its first sessions just this week on September 10th. And it will begin continuing this story of looking at policies that especially impact people of color, and looking for solutions to issues that the community is facing, using, of course, research, analytics to look at all that, to look at these gerrymandered districts, and to look at the voting patterns, and to really help us to focus attention on these deserts, these transportation, food, and medical deserts that don't just impact communities of color, but impact the entire community as a whole. And then we have a new institute that we're launching, the Film and Humanities Institute, that we're partnering with Brian Favors and Nate Parker to host workshops, Film Institute workshops that will attract students from all over the country to come and learn about this filmmaking, storytelling, especially from the perspectives of people of color. And, of course, we will continue to have public programs and forums to provide information to the general public and to especially our students about the history, the culture, the issues that are facing us, and give people a place, a safe space to hear and talk about and interact with not just the scholars, but those on the front lines who are working to make a difference.
It's the conversation. How can people find out more about this upcoming summit?
Go to just Google 1619 Making of America, and you will click on that link, and it will take you to the site where you can register.
Absolutely.
So 1619 Making of America, all one word.
Absolutely. It really has been my pleasure to have both of you here. This was such an important and necessary conversation to have, and I cannot wait for the summit that's going to take place. So we have been listening to Dr. Cassandra Newby Alexander. She's the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts here at Norfolk State University. Dean, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.
And Dr. William Alexander, Professor of History and also the Director of the International Program, also here at Norfolk State University. Sir, thank you for being here as well.
Thank you.
And we thank our listeners. Remember, we are here every Friday, 5 p.m. to 7 p.m. If you've missed anything, don't forget that we rebroadcast this very show every Sunday at noon. We're on all aspects of social media. And if you have any suggestions about topics, don't hesitate to contact me. It's bkadams@nsu.edu. That's bkadams@nsu.edu. We're excited about the summit that's coming up. We're excited about changing the narrative. We're excited about you being a part of what we do here at Hampton Roads Voices. We thank you for being here, and we'll see you next time on Hot 91. The views and opinions expressed on this program are not those of Norfolk State University or WNSB-FM. Thank you for listening.